July 11, 1804. Weehawken, New Jersey. The morning mist clings to the cliffs overlooking the Hudson River. Two of the most powerful men in America stand 10 paces apart. One is the Vice President of the United States, Burr. The other is the architect of the American financial system, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton raises his pistol, squinting through his glasses. He has already written his will. He has already told his friends he intends to throw away his shot, to fire into the air. But Burr is looking for blood. A single crack of gunpowder shatters the morning silence. Hamilton collapses. A man who survived the bloody fields of Yorktown and built a nation's economy out of thin air is brought down by a single lead ball. But to understand why the most brilliant mind of the founding generation ended up bleeding out on a dirt track in New Jersey, we have to go back. Not to the halls of Congress, but to a place of desperate poverty and tropical heat. Alexander Hamilton was never supposed to succeed. In a world governed by bloodlines and inherited wealth, he was a nobody. Born on the island of Nevis, he was the product of an illicit affair. His father, James Hamilton, abandoned the family. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, died of a brutal fever when Alexander was just 13. Imagine the scene: a young boy, waking up in a bed next to his mother's cooling corpse, himself delirious with the same sickness. He was left with nothing: no money, no family, and the stinging stigma of illegitimacy. In the 18th century, being a bastard was a social death sentence. But Hamilton had one weapon: his nib. He began working as a clerk for an import-export firm, Beekman and Kruger. While other teenagers were playing, Hamilton was calculating currency exchange rates, managing international shipping manifests, and learning the brutal mechanics of global trade, including the horrific reality of the slave trade that fueled the islands. Then, in 1772, a monster arrived. A hurricane leveled the island of Christiansted. Young Hamilton wrote a letter to his father describing the carnage. He wrote with such terrifying, vivid prose describing the roaring of the sea and the fiery meteors in the sky that the local community was stunned. They realized this boy was too gifted for a sugar plantation. They took up a collection. They bought him a ticket to New York. He stepped off the boat into a city on the verge of a revolution. He wasn't just looking for an education, he was looking for a war. He knew that in a stable society, a bastard stays at the bottom, but in a revolution, a man with a pen and a steady hand can climb to the very top. By the time he met George Washington, Hamilton wasn't just a student, he was a powder keg ready to explode. He didn't just want to join the American story, he wanted to write it. When Alexander Hamilton stepped onto the docks of Manhattan, he didn't just join a college. He joined a movement. New York in the 1770s was a powder keg. While studying at King's College, Hamilton wasn't just reading Cicero and Xenophon. He was listening to the whispers of rebellion in the taverns. He was a young man in a hurry, and for a genius with no money, a revolution was the ultimate opportunity. Before he ever fired a gun, he fired his pen. At just 19, he was writing sophisticated political broadsides that held their own against seasoned British loyalists. But when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, Hamilton knew that ink wouldn't be enough. He traded his books for a uniform, organizing a volunteer artillery company. He wasn't just a theorist, he was a leader. At the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton, his cannons provided the cover Washington's retreating army desperately needed. It was here that the most important partnership in American history was born. George Washington was a man of immense presence, but he was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the war. He needed a brain. He needed someone who could speak French, draft orders, manage the logistics of a starving army, and think 3 steps ahead of the British. He chose Hamilton. For years, Hamilton served as Washington's aide-de-camp. To the outside world, it was a position of immense power, but for Hamilton, it was a gilded cage. He didn't want to write letters, he wanted to lead men. He wanted a field command, that glorious moment in battle that would secure his place in the history books forever. His relationship with Washington was father-son in its complexity, full of deep respect, but also explosive tension. Hamilton once famously snapped at Washington for keeping him waiting on a staircase, an ego clash that nearly ended their partnership. Finally, in 1781, Hamilton got his wish: the Siege of Yorktown. Washington gave him command of a battalion to lead a night assault on Redoubt No. 10. This was Hamilton's shot. To ensure total surprise, he ordered his men to unload their muskets. They would take the British position with cold steel alone. Hamilton was the first over the wall. In the chaotic, terrifying darkness of the trenches, he proved he wasn't just a man of words. The redoubt fell in minutes. Yorktown effectively ended the war. But as the British surrendered, Hamilton looked at the newly born United States and saw a new, even more dangerous battle on the horizon. The war for independence was won, but the war for the soul of the nation, its economy, its laws, and its survival was just beginning. The guns of the revolution had fallen silent, but for Alexander Hamilton, the real battle was just beginning. The United States in the 1780s was a failed experiment. The nation was drowning in debt, the currency was worthless, and the states were bickering like rival kingdoms. To the world, America looked like a temporary accident. Hamilton knew that without a strong central heart, the body of the new republic would die. In 1789, George Washington became the first president and handed Hamilton the hardest job in the room, Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton didn't just want to pay the bills, he wanted to build a financial superpower. His vision was radical. He proposed that the federal government assume all state debts, create a national bank, and establish a manufacturing-based economy. But there was a mountain in his way: Thomas Jefferson. If Hamilton was the visionary of the city, Jefferson was the champion of the farm. Jefferson saw Hamilton's plan as a British-style conspiracy to enslave the people through debt. Their rivalry became the blueprint for the American two-party system. It wasn't just politics, it was a clash of two different futures for humanity. The tension reached a breaking point in 1790. This led to the dinner table bargain, the most famous meal in political history. In a private meeting arranged by Jefferson, Hamilton traded the location of the nation's permanent capital. He agreed to move the capital to a swampy patch on the Potomac River, now Washington, D.C., in exchange for Jefferson's allies supporting his financial plan. Hamilton gave up a city to gain a nation's credit. Hamilton's work ethic was supernatural. He was writing thousands of pages of reports, legal theories, and defenses of the Constitution. He famously wrote 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers in a span of months, often while managing his law practice. He was a man who believed he was running out of time. He was building the Coast Guard, the Customs Service, and the First Bank of the United States. He was turning a collection of loose colonies into a singular, respected empire. But as his power grew, so did his list of enemies. And in the shadows of his success, a personal secret was about to collide with his public glory, proving that the man who could master a nation's economy could not master his own impulses. Alexander Hamilton was a master of systems, a genius of logic, and a titan of debate. But he had a fatal flaw, an obsession with his own reputation that bordered on madness. In the summer of 1791, while his wife Eliza and their children were visiting family, a young woman named Maria Reynolds appeared at Hamilton's door in Philadelphia. She claimed her husband had abandoned her and begged for money. Hamilton, moved by her story or perhaps by her presence, walked to her house that evening to deliver the funds. It was a trap. Maria's husband, James Reynolds, was a small-time criminal who soon began blackmailing the Secretary of the Treasury. For a year, Hamilton paid hush money to keep the affair a secret. Years later, his political enemies, including James Monroe and Aaron Burr, discovered the payments. They suspected Hamilton was using government funds for illegal speculation. To any other politician, the solution was simple: admit to the affair privately and let it blow over. But Hamilton was terrified that people would think he was a corrupt official. He chose a path that shocked the nation. His public image was shattered. The man who could have been president had just set his own career on fire. But the true tragedy was only beginning. In 1801, his eldest son, Philip, challenged a man to a duel for insulting his father's name. At just 19 years old, the same age Alexander was when he joined the revolution, Philip was shot and killed on the same fields in Weehawken where his father would one day fall. Hamilton was never the same. The spark of the unstoppable genius began to fade. He moved his family to a country home called the Grange, seeking peace, but his political rivalries followed him like ghosts. By the election of 1800, Hamilton found himself in a nightmare, a tie for the presidency between Thomas Jefferson, his ideological enemy, and Aaron Burr, a man he viewed as a soulless opportunist. Jefferson has beliefs, Hamilton famously wrote. Burr has none. Hamilton threw his weight behind Jefferson, securing the presidency for his rival and making Aaron Burr his eternal enemy. The stage was set, the man of words had spoken to many, and the man of silence, Aaron Burr, had finally heard enough. July 1804. The letters between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr had become toxic. Burr, the sitting vice president, demanded an apology for years of insults. Hamilton, trapped by his own code of honor, refused to back down. He spent his final night at his home, the Grange, writing a letter to his wife Eliza, best of wives and best of women. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. On the morning of the 11th, they crossed the Hudson. According to the rules of the Code Duello, they stood 10 paces apart. Hamilton, who had lost his son to this same ritual, had made a secret decision. He would not kill Burr. He adjusted his glasses and fired, hitting a tree branch high above Burr's head. He threw away his shot. But Burr did not miss. The bullet struck Hamilton in the abdomen, fracturing a rib and tearing through his liver before lodging in his spine. He collapsed instantly. "I am a dead man," he whispered to the doctor. He was rowed back across the river, and during 31 hours of agonizing pain, surrounded by his weeping wife and 7 children. At age 47 or 49, as history still debates, the man who built the American engine breathed his last. For a moment, it seemed Hamilton would be forgotten. His enemies Jefferson, Madison, Monroe would hold the presidency for the next 24 years, working to dismantle his vision of a powerful central government. Aaron Burr fled into the shadows, a political pariah forever branded a murderer. But the world Hamilton imagined was already in motion. The reason we remember him today isn't just because of his genius, it's because of Eliza. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton lived for 50 years after her husband's death. She was destitute, but she was determined. She interviewed his contemporaries, collected his thousands of pages of writing, and forced the world to acknowledge his contribution. She founded New York's first private orphanage, a tribute to the orphan from Nevis who changed the world. Look around modern America. When you use a credit card, you are using Hamilton's system. When you see the Coast Guard, you are seeing his Navy. When you argue about the power of the federal government, you are speaking his language. Alexander Hamilton was a man of contradictions, an immigrant who loved a country that didn't always love him back. A financial wizard who died in debt, a master of words who spoke too much. He didn't live to see the superpower he designed, but he died knowing that he had laid the foundation. He never became president, but he did something more. He invented the American future.